Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to this Christie's Education webinar, Women Artists of Southeast Asia, Path to Visibility and Collecting with Purpose. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joyce Chung, Program Manager at Christie's Education, and I will be your host this afternoon or evening, wherever you are, alongside our wonderful lecturer, Krystina Lyon. We are delighted to deliver this lecture to celebrate International Women's Day here at Christie's. So, Krystina Lyon is an art historian, collector, and advocate for women artists in Southeast Asia, having completed her MA with distinction in Asian art histories at Goldsmiths University of London. She has since lectured, written, and spoken widely on Southeast Asian contemporary art. Her first publication, You Are Seen, Women's Contemporary Art Practices in Southeast Asia, explores the practices of 35 artists from the region, and she will speak about this later in this lecture. It's currently available in Singapore, where she's recently moved to London from. Krystina will be on hand to answer your questions on her lecture at the end. So the Q&A chat box is open throughout. Please feel free to include your questions in there for her. Before I hand you over to Krystina to begin today's session, please allow me to read the following notice. By registering for this event, you agree not to record the event in any way. All attendees will be muted and remain anonymous. This lecture is being recorded, as you might have heard before, and all registered participants will receive the recording shortly after the end of the webinar with a 2-week expiry date. This webinar will also be made available on our YouTube page in due course. And last thing, Krystina also wanted me to highlight a brief content note for today. Today's lecture includes references to violence and sexual assault, as is the nature of some of these works. So if you prefer to engage with the material in a different way, as I mentioned before, the recording will be available to you in a little bit. So thank you very much for your attention. And the floor is yours, Krystina.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Can you hear me? Just want to double check, confirm, as they say in Singapore.
Perfect.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and also thanks to Christie's Art Education Program for the invitation to be here. Hello and welcome to everyone with us today. This is the largest international audience I have had. Usually I am talking to small groups in our apartment with the artworks around us and a much needed wine glass in hand. But I am always delighted to join International Women's Day in the worldwide engagement to advance women's equality and gender parity. Today, I will be celebrating women's achievements in the visual arts by sharing the art practice of 7 artists from Southeast Asia, specifically Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, and Timor-Leste, highlighting some of the different pathways to visibility and recognition in a still unbalanced art environment where male artists are disproportionately represented in institutions, galleries, and collections. Historically, there have been many common factors for women all over the world that contributed to this imbalance, such as the need for juggling the cradle-to-grave caring responsibilities of family life, systemic barriers, lack of mentorship, in addition to the specific local, cultural, religious, and or political expectations frequently at play in the Southeast Asian region. Each of the artists in today's presentation have experienced significant struggles of their own, such as surviving migration, forced displacement, sometimes exile, being ostracized by their own communities and governments, facing censorship, limited public funding, working without institutional support, and being denied the same access to art education in more conservative societies. The knock-on effect of these challenges is that many women artists find it difficult to produce the consistent body of work needed for exhibitions because their practice often has to expand and contract in response to the realities of their lives. In an informal interview, I conducted an informal straw poll of 20 commercial galleries in Singapore and Malaysia about 2 years ago in 2024. I asked how many women artists did they represent, and with 2 exceptions only, the answer was 1/3 of their artist representation were women. I was glad to learn recently that a professional quantitative survey has been commissioned by one of the major visual arts bodies in the region, as it is only with more hard data that these inequities can be addressed. So I would like to start with a very short interview. Slide, please. In this presentation, I am considering three interconnected questions. How have these artists created visibility for themselves despite structural barriers? What pathways have some of these contemporary artists taken to sustain their practice and stay relevant? And how can collectors like me engage with their work with care and purpose? Before I begin properly, I will just locate myself briefly as to why I'm focused on the region in general and women artists in particular. Slide, please. I've lived over half my life in Southeast Asia now, 15 years in the Philippines and over 2 decades in Singapore. This duration matters because it allowed for sustained relationships, familiarity, and trust to develop between me, the artists, their galleries, the institutions, other art collectors, and also to be able to navigate the art ecosystem in general. Being based in Singapore provided an ideal location from which to explore museums, biennales, exhibitions, artist studios, art fairs, galleries, and other private collections in the region. Before I started immersing myself in this world, I was a docent at several heritage museums in Singapore for about a decade, following which I completed an MA in Asian art histories through the joint program between Goldsmiths University in London and LaSalle College of the Arts in Singapore. I focused my thesis on women's art collectives in the Philippines and Thailand, and with this background and desire to use my learning, I started to collect artists whose practice focused on untold or hidden stories about women in the region. My most recent project that Joyce mentioned was to publish a book of the collection to create long-term visibility for the artists, to provide greater access to these artistic practices, as well as having a record of the collection that has now been transferred to London since relocating 3 weeks ago. I hope to continue with this project long-term through active dialogue, lending of works for educational purposes, and continued engagement with the artists. Before I share the images of the artists and their practices, I will provide a short introduction to the region, by no means complete, but useful for some necessary context. Slide, please. So for over 2,000 years, the geographic area known today as Southeast Asia functioned as a crossroads for interconnected trade routes between China, India, and the Islamic world, and produced rich and multi-layered civilizations, powerful kingdoms, maritime empires, and city-states shaped by Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, and later Christianity. Apart from Thailand, each country in this region experienced rule from Western colonizers keen to establish strategic footholds, monopolize trade routes, and also for economic gain through the exploitation of highly desirable products such as spices and much later, natural renewable resources like timber and rubber. Fast forward to the latter half of the 20th century, after the Second World War, the newly independent nations faced complex and often traumatic processes of nation building, sometimes marked by conflict and political upheaval. Today, the region is frequently associated with rapid economic growth and modernization, yet this can obscure the fact that many societies are still deeply connected to agrarian histories and have very diverse religious and ethnic communities. Please forgive this historical gallop, but I wanted to give some context to the layered historical and cultural landscape that the artists in today's presentation are working from as they respond to questions of identity, memory, gender, and social change. Slide, please. So why have I focused on collecting women artists? It wasn't a corrective gesture at first, it was more an observation. Across different countries and contexts, I had encountered interesting practices that were often under-recognized and underdocumented. They often dealt with taboo or sensitive subjects that were difficult to discuss openly in societies governed by rigid social norms. I was interested in the way these women artists chose to work with great subtlety, often whilst remaining uncompromising. My academic research for my MA on two women's art collectives, Kasibulan, founded in the late 80s in the Philippines, and International Collective Womanifesto, founded in the 90s in Thailand, had already given me an understanding that there were different methods of mediating the patriarchy. Different contexts, different times required different strategies. Some artists work within institutions, reshaping them from the inside. Others work around them, building parallel structures and other opportunities for visibility. But what unites them is negotiation, a constant recalibration of visibility, risk, and survival. And I have one final slide, I promise, for context. We just need to talk about the F word. And Joyce, don't worry, I'm not going to start talking in profanities. I just wanted to draw attention for our international audience that unlike Western feminist theory, Southeast Asian scholarship in this area emerged differently, often indirectly, culturally or politically, rather than as a named movement. Some of the reasons are feminism was often overshadowed by the nationalist and post-colonial struggles, where gender issues were often considered secondary to these priorities. Feminism was also viewed with suspicion, historically perceived as Western, individualistic, and culturally disruptive. Religious and cultural norms strongly contribute to how gender roles are shaped, making public discussion of sexuality or gender sensitive. Some artists explore these issues symbolically rather than directly to avoid censorship and brushes with authoritarian politics. Women artists were often excluded from art histories due to a still developing institutional art history, and like elsewhere in the world, museums, critics, and galleries historically prioritized male artists. The same problem raised by the American art historian Linda Nochlin in her 1971 essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Something that I witnessed firsthand whilst doing my field research on women's art collectives was that they favored art residencies, collaborative projects, rural art initiatives, and contributions to archives for a quieter, more collaborative model that allowed networks to flourish. There was also a tendency for artistic expression rooted in lived experience, engaging themes such as domestic labor, migration, motherhood, the female body, political violence, and ecological relationships. So let's move on now to how these 6 artists created visibility for themselves despite the challenges they faced, and learn about the different paths they have taken to sustain their practice. Slide, please. The first artist I would like to introduce is Oktora Chan, known professionally by her first name, Oktora. She was born in 1982 in Bandung, in Indonesia, and is a 4th-generation Indonesian. She witnessed radical social and political shifts in the late 90s during the widespread political and economic unrest in Indonesia, when Chinese Indonesians were targeted in violent riots that included looting, killings, and sexual violence fueled by deep-seated ethnic tensions amidst the fall of President Suharto in 1998. These experiences made her question power dynamics within society in relation to gender, identity, and race, and she studied law before shifting to the arts. She completed an MA in Fine Arts in Australia, where she still lives. She's a multidisciplinary artist and incorporates performance, photography, screen printing, embroidery, and has recently added tapestry and weaving to her practice. She has an ongoing fascination with image, official history, and collective memory from her home country. Slide, please. So we're looking at our first two artworks. These two artworks were influenced by Octora's encounters with colonial era photographs taken from the archives at the Leiden University in Netherlands, where she during her studies. In ad infinitum, the image on the left, Octora is restaging a photograph she found in those archives of a Balinese legong dancer from the turn of the last century. These dancers were adolescents classically trained from a very young age in the traditional dances of Hindu epics from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, performed to this day in Bali. Thanks for this slide. She then sorry, I'm reading the wrong bit. Here we are. In this image, you see Octora in the process of restaging the original photograph from the archives, the image on the extreme left. What she is doing is commenting on the colonial male gaze as these ethnographic images that were taken without the permission of the subject as a colonial form of administrative control. How does she do it? She uses herself as the model. You can see in the middle picture that she's sitting there and she has a photographer taking the picture. She's dressed herself in traditional costume and headdress, and she's restaging the photo shoot, performing being the subject of the colonizer's male gaze. And the image that she took on the extreme right is now seen. That picture on the right is Octora, and she then used it for, if we could return to the original artwork in the picture on the, sorry, in the image on the left. And how did she do this? She transferred the screen print of the image that she took onto glass with a brass background and secured it with a wooden frame. And she's taken that image of the legong dancer that had been basically long held inanimate in the archives, and introduced a new energy and dignity with her choice of materials for this artwork. The title, Ad Infinitum, also refers to the archival image that attempted to define, contain, and possess this young dancer for eternity. Octora has commented that she wanted to release her, and as a Chinese-Indonesian minority herself, she identifies strongly with these marginalized Balinese women from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second image on the right is a tapestry called Recoup 1920 and was made 4 years later using the same staging that she had created for the image on the left. She started to weave in wool and has added gold thread into the tapestry to elevate and introduce a preciousness to the figure of the legong dancer. Of equal importance is the shift in the position to show the back of the legong dancer, in this case, her own back. One can read this tapestry in many different ways, but I believe Octora is looking to bestow some agency on this forgotten dancer by arranging her in a position that shows defiance and reveals nothing of her but her back towards the viewer. Looking at the two works 4 years apart, the one that she did on the right was a work she did during COVID. What is important is not that the subject matter has been repeated, but that the repetition becomes a deliberate strategy formulated by the artist. Each iteration of the restaging of the archival image of the unknown Balinese dancer allows the work to circulate again in new contexts with new audiences like ours today, and has new meanings. rather than remaining in the unacknowledged and unhappy archival pose. Visibility is achieved by sharing, it is sustained and renewed over time. Auctora shows us that visibility is something that must be actively maintained, not static or even assumed. She uses her practice to retrieve these forgotten stories about the lives of unknown, unnamed, and marginalized women from the past for some kind of reparation of the past injustices. And now we go to another Indonesian artist from Bali, Chitra Sasmita, who was born in 1990 and who is a self-taught artist who studied literature, physics, and worked as a short story illustrator before developing her fine art practice. Sasmita concerns herself with shedding misconceptions about Balinese art, culture, and gender norms that have been complicated over time by foreign notions of what constitutes authenticity in Balinese classic painting. She also questions deeply the place of women in the contemporary social hierarchy of Bali, with its deeply entrenched patriarchy traditions, customs, and rituals, and takes every opportunity to foreground women in her multidisciplinary practice. Her own remit is breathtaking in its ambition. Her stated aims are to celebrate women's roles as transmitters of knowledge across the generations, something she feels has been neglected since the time of colonialism and the added influence of visiting Western painters who contributed to the exoticization of Bali and its tourist culture. She combines her own experiences as a woman and a mother living in a society that is still largely patriarchal to become closer to a purer essence of art as practiced before. She writes poetry, books, she talks on Biennale platforms. She recently had a solo exhibition at the Barbican last year and is invited to participate in international art residencies, most recently in Norway. She's in control of her own immense social media presence and is prolific. I urge you to follow her. Let's see two examples of her work. So, like Auctora, these examples are of works made 4 years apart and help us see how her practice and confidence develops over time. Sasmita paints in what's called the Kamasan traditional style of painting. This technique originated from East Bali around the 15th century, and the canvas is still made from raw cotton cloth with ground rice flour to stiffen it before being laid out to dry in very intense sunlight. It is then burnished with stone or shells to create a sort of matte surface ideal for receiving paints. This painting technique was practiced exclusively by male artists to narrate Hindu epics. Women were allowed to contribute by drawing the patterns in the borders before handing the canvas to the male artists to complete. What Sasmita does is reimagine these classical narratives and uses the technique to celebrate female resistance. So if you look, for instance, at the first artwork on the left called High Priestess from 2021, we see that there are still some traditional codes in place, such as the intricate border, the use of color palette of red, gold, and black, the flat figurative images on the Kamasan canvas. Not so traditional is the foregrounded nude female figure, encircled by a group of women's heads with long hair flowing with multiple images of sacred fire around her. In the work on the right, which is called I Am Mother of Sacred Fire, there are no longer any painted borders. She has burst out of those confines and introduced natural materials like horsehair and found antique objects. Still recognizable in the language of the Balinese cultural aesthetic, and their beliefs. For instance, the Balinese believe the earth is feminine, and Sasmita has depicted a tree emerging as an organ from the woman lying on the earth in the bottom of this image. Fire is a form of spiritual cleansing, and snakes relate to infinity and eternal renewal, all reworked and included to subvert the submissive role assigned to women in recent Balinese history. We don't have more time to go deeply into the details of this work, but in her words, she hopes to create, and I quote, a spiritual journey where the richness and history of Balinese traditions and rituals can be viscerally felt by those experiencing these works. The next slide is of one of her works. It's not in my collection. It's called Ode to Sun, and it was from an exhibition in Singapore, I believe in 2020. I include it to show you the large scale work that she does, an installation that was hung in Yo Workshop, the gallery that represents her in Singapore. It's very impactful. In this work, she's tracing marginalized narratives of women who played key roles in Balinese society and who also held influential positions, such as transmitters of general knowledge, of generational knowledge. There are 3 layers of narrative printed onto these Kamasan canvases over a circle of the spice turmeric beneath that is used for rituals. Incidentally, the turmeric that's placed there relates to the sun in the title. It's called Ode to Sun. So this visibility is created through strategic engagement, working within historical forms to shift what and who can be seen. It emerges through negotiation with history, with canon, and with power. Rather than rejecting the canon, Chitra is entering it. Literally, I forgot to mention that all the illustrations of this single female figure are, are her mother, and to her represents the every woman. Um, and she's basically mapping how women have been stereotyped and is offering counter readings that foreground Balinese women as leaders, as thinkers, as resistors that have always been present, but that were allowed to be forgotten. So we're leaving Indonesia now and joining Engwith Chandaneth from Cambodia. Engwith Chandaneth was born in 1993 and graduated in design from the SETEC Institute in Phnom Penh. She furthered her studies in photography, film, and mixed media at Sasa Art Projects, which was an art-run initiative that really filled a necessary gap. I mean, necessarily filled a gap in contemporary art education for 14 years before it closed in 2024. She is a member of the White Building Collective, a group of young artists in residence programs a group of young artists who make short films and publish online photo stories. She has exhibited locally, internationally, and been invited to artist in residence programs in the US and Japan, and also works as a film designer. Her practice offers another pathway to visibility with the focus on the environment and ecology. So this work on the left is called Scars, and the shot was taken as an installation in a gallery in Singapore called the Jendela Gallery at the Esplanade. And the image on the right is how it was hung in our apartment. It was one of the works where my husband and I were thinking, oh my goodness, how are we going to include it? But it actually was one of the star pieces in the collection, and as you can see, looks wonderful. This work was originally shown in a group collaborative exhibition in Singapore called Shaking Land and Water, about the impacts and implications of human intervention on the environment. 3 artists from Cambodia were paired with 3 artists from Singapore to converse about these issues, and the resulting works were then exhibited. Eng was born only 14 years after the end of the Khmer Rouge regime and the genocide that led to the deaths of up to an unbelievable quarter of the Cambodian population. So the name of the work, Scars, could easily refer to the visible and invisible scars left by this historical collective trauma. But as part of a new generation, living and working in Phnom Penh today, she is looking outward and concerned with exploring a shared, uncertain future that comes from, and I quote her, climate change, war, disease, environmental collapse, and a spiritual disconnect caused by selfishness and the obsession with power. Many lakes, farms, and rice paddies in Cambodia are slowly being destroyed due to unplanned rapid urbanization, leading to problems like flooding, the displacement of low-income families, and a host of other problems. In her own practice, she tries to work sustainably when possible, and these works are actually made out of papier-mâché from reused newspaper, for example. The more industrial copper pipes that she's used for the stems contrast well with this gentle paper. The lotus holds much significance in Indonesia, sustaining life during famine through its roots, nourishing everyday cuisine and medicine through its stems and flowers, and carrying deep and cultural and carrying deep cultural and spiritual meaning. Eng uses the lotus as a metaphor for survival and endurance due to its ability to grow in the mud. As a new mother, Daneth says that she now reads this work differently, not only as a remembrance of these harsh times, but as a way to envision healing for the planet and future generations. She imagines herself at the bottom of the pond, looking up at the flower and the sky beyond, and the lotus to her becomes a symbol of hope. The work demonstrates how valuable visibility can be created through these participations in public platforms, cross-cultural exchanges, and an enlarged regional network. The next artwork is from an artist that is originally from Myanmar, Shu Wai. She was born in 1992 and is an artist who explores the intersections of gender, culture, and social justice through a practice deeply rooted in the cultural and political landscape of Myanmar. During the recent 2021 military coup, she fled the country after her protest art drew the attention of the military junta. After relocating, unfortunately, to the Ukraine, she had to make a further move due to the ongoing conflict there and is now living and working in France. Her art engages with both the history and contemporary dynamics of Burmese and Buddhist culture, focusing on the roles and resistance of women in traditional societies. Her evolving practice encompasses painting, fabric, collages, found media, and using these mediums as a means to challenge societal norms and address the enduring struggles of women. As with the other artists we have seen so far, these personal experiences have significantly influenced her artistic direction. Her work transcends mere documentation by subverting traditional narratives to offer a more nuanced portrayal of female identity and resistance. Her practice has evolved into a powerful form of self-expression, shedding light on hidden and often overlooked forms of gender and social injustice. And I would say it's why I asked her permission to use this work for the front cover of my recently published book called You Are Seen, as it brings to life the idea of lifting the veil off hidden women's stories. Let's have a look at the the rest of the work. This is a series. The work that I used for the front cover is the one in the middle. And the title of these works is Exile, Weaving a New Life, numbers 1, 2, and 3. Shu Wai transforms her personal displacement into a deep artistic meditation. This ongoing series merges traditional Myanmar fabrics used for clothing with archival photographic prints, elevating ancient weaving techniques historically used for functional items like baskets, and transforms them into powerful contemporary art. Now that Myanmar is living under an authoritarian regime that subjects many of its people to daily violence, marginalized communities in particular, the choice of these typical fabrics also speaks bravely to the many diverse ethnic groups throughout the country. She layers reprints of old photographs of Burmese women with fabric, so faces appear and disappear beneath the strands, and poignantly, this gentle obscuring reflects the artist's fading memories of her own home, where beloved features of family members and friends become harder to recall over distance and time. The partially concealed faces serve as metaphors for her exile itself, how displacement fractures her connection to home, leaving only fragments of what was once whole. Gosh, I'm overcome. Yet through the act of weaving, she asserts her agency, transforming loss into creation and absence into presence, demonstrating how art becomes a vital form of survival and resistance against erasure. I encourage you to discover her social media. She's determined to live life well and not have her young life diminished in any way by the trials she has endured that led to her exile. I think it was a piece of performance art in particular that gave her this difficulty. There are images of her living a life filled with travel, with sport, with museum visits, social events, all the while looking happy, fashionable, curious, and energetic. As she herself says, where I come from, posting on social media can put you in danger, even jail. So being able to share my art freely is not just a tool, it's a privilege. And this I found on one of her Instagram posts, September the 10th last year. So I think it's the accumulation of all of this that's making me so emotional. But now we're going to the Philippines to visit Imelda Kahipe Endaya. Kahipe Endaya was born in 1949 in the Philippines, and she is one of the most distinguished senior artists practicing there today. She's an artist, curator, author, organizer, activist, the list goes on, community leader, and has been recognized with awards from the Cultural Center of the Philippines and the American Society of Contemporary Arts. She is also one of 5 co-founders of women's art collective Kasibulan, the initials of which roughly translate to Women in Art and Emerging Consciousness, founded in 1987, that include artists Brenda Fajardo, Julie Luch, Anna Fair, and Sister Ida Bugayong. Her practice includes mixed media paintings, prints, installations, and she has dedicated her very long career to visualizing contemporary social issues from the point of view of women's empowerment. She and her co-founders are credited with placing women's issues onto the national discourse, whereas they had not been previously. Endaya's work has been acquired by many institutions in the Philippines, Singapore, Japan, and the US. I have one small print of Imelda's in my collection, of which I'm very proud, and here it is. Kahipe Ndaya's photo engravings from 1979 belong to an important movement in Philippine art when artists were turning to printmaking as both an aesthetic and political practice during the nation's troubled, turbulent times. Working during the Marcos dictatorship, which incidentally is when I was living in the Philippines, she used the medium's reproducibility to broaden access to images that reclaimed memory, identity, and cultural heritage. At the time, she was questioning what makes us Filipino. She draws from archival materials, old documents, colonial scripts, indigenous textiles, and historical photographs to deconstruct narratives of erasure and exclusion. An example of that violence against memory is visualized here in this artwork called Página 1, where silhouettes of the marginalized are erased and removed, invoking the tensions between indigenous origins and colonial legacies. There's a lot to absorb in this early work of hers. Again, the title gives us a clue. Página means page in Tagalog, alluding to authorship, as opposed to the Spanish página, which is pronounced the same way but spelt differently. And that's where the key difference lies. Her works are not only records of loss, but reminders of indigenous knowledge in search for a national identity. You see what she's done here. If you look at those images, she has the images of the mestizos, the indios, from a genre called Tipos del País, and she's printed them there and cut them out also and erased them because, of course, that's how she's relating to these reminders of indigenous knowledge that have been erased. Her later body of work focuses on highlighting solidarity with women with no voice from marginalized communities, such as in her very large-scale mixed media works. One of these works is in the permanent collection at the National Gallery, Singapore, and is currently on display at the wonderful group show there, curated by Jolene Lowe, called Fear No Power, Women Imagining Otherwise. Any of our audience who are in the region, in Singapore or nearby, should try to catch it. It's going to be on until November and is a joyous example of 5 senior women artists' practice from Southeast Asia that is as engaged and relevant today as when the works were created. I'm just going to show you, where do I have it? Oh, yes. Sorry, I just wanted to share the exhibition catalog. Can you see that? That comes from the National Gallery about this exhibition. It's a fabulous book for anybody interested in this topic. Ndaya works tirelessly to this day in her many roles as an organizer, artist, and educator to highlight the struggles of women from marginalized communities in the Philippines. I would like to read her words from a recent article by Audrey Carpio in Vogue, Manila, about an exhibition she participated back in 2005 with more photo engravings about which she says her intentions were the following. And this is a quote. I was comparing Juan Luna's Spoliarium, which is always regarded as the great masterpiece of a nationalist in the Philippines. Kahipe Ndaya explains, but we have many works of women which are just as good, maybe not as large, but they are very good, expressing the feelings of women and the collective consciousness of women. In my opinion, she has always had a very, very clear idea of the worth of women's work. So the next slide, we're going to Singapore via Australia. This is Suzanne Victor. She was born in 1959. She's now based in Australia, and her practice has been shaped by both interruption and return. She has a BA, MA, PhD from the University of Western Sydney in Australia, and exhibits globally. Following the 1994 closure of the artist-run space called Fifth Passage that she co-founded with two other artists, unscripted performance art in Singapore was effectively silenced for a decade due to the suspension of funding, and it profoundly affected artists working in this medium. The incident that caused offense was an unscripted performance by a fellow artist who was protesting how gay men had been treated during an incident with the police. Whilst not involved with the performance herself, she was implicated as the founder organizer of the event. Although the group remained intact for a couple of years after this event, they eventually disbanded and left Singapore to pursue studies elsewhere. Her career effectively interrupted. Less than 10 years later, however, Suzanne was one of 4 artists chosen to represent Singapore at the Venice Biennale in 2001. She's also served as the director of the Singapore Art Museum and been reincorporated fully into the Singapore National Art Discourse with major installation works in the permanent collection of 3 institutions: the Singapore Art Museum, the National Gallery of Singapore, and the National Museum. Thanks for this slide. This work is part of a series of lens paintings, as she calls them, created in a 2-year period from 2020 to 2022. And it addresses the harrowing personal histories of some women in the region that have long remained obscured or strategically withheld. The inspiration came from a close friend of hers who shared that she had learned unexpectedly and traumatically about her grandmother's secret past as a coerced comfort woman, enslaved by the Japanese military in the Second World War. Victor created these works to honor her friend's grandmother and all the women who suffered a similar fate during the war. The work comprises a base painting that was made from a digital patchwork of postcards that circulated in the early 20th century of women from the region. Overlaid, but standing a little bit proud, are hundreds of Fresnel lenses that distort and disrupt the act of looking itself, as if showing multiple different shifting viewpoints rather than a single authoritative official narrative. So yes, visibility can be taken away, but it can also be rebuilt. And this slide shows the same artwork, but a detail of 3 of the scorched areas where the viewer can look closely at the faces of these ordinary women, someone's mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, taken from these circulating postcards and repainted onto the canvas and then obscured with the lenses. These scorch marks not only show more clearly some of the faces, but hint at a kind of open wound, as if cauterized to symbolize the suffering of these women. The women in these paintings are testimonies to the deep courage and strength in the face of undeservedly imposed shame, silence, and taboo over decades. To conclude, Victor's practice demonstrates how visibility can be taken away, but how it can be rebuilt. The trajectory of her art practice reminds us that recognition is not necessarily linear. It requires advocacy, recontextualization, and the willingness of institutions and collectors to return to work that was once marginalized or suppressed. Difficult themes that refer to unresolved collective or personal trauma also requires bravery from the artist and the exhibiting institution, and we'll see an example of this with the last artwork that I will be sharing with you. This is Maria Madeira, who was born in Timor-Leste in 1966 and lived there till she was 9. As a result of the 1975 Indonesian invasion of East Timor, she and her family were relocated to a refugee camp in Portugal. She migrated to Australia in 1983 and returns to Timor-Leste to contribute as an artist, an educator, and cultural advisor. She holds a PhD in art from Curtin University in Perth and exhibits internationally. She is multidisciplinary and works across painting, drawing, performance, mixed media collage, and sculpture. The culture, history, and traditions of Timor influence her work, and she was the first artist to be invited to represent this new country, Timor-Leste, as at its first appearance at the 60th Venice Biennale in 2024. The work she presented, called Kiss and Don't Tell, was a site-specific installation that used paintings, video, performance, and sound to portray a time in Timor's recent history of violence perpetrated against women during the civil war with Indonesia and their resilience in the face of internalized shame they faced from the community. I strongly recommend all of you, please, to watch a clip. I don't have it here. You must do it yourself and prepare yourself because it appears on YouTube. It's very difficult not to be moved by the power and vulnerability of her presence as she invokes the ordeal these women faced by she applies lipstick to her lips and kisses the walls of the space that she was given in Venice while singing traditional songs in Tetun, the indigenous language. Her practice is a very meaningful example of how visibility is created when performance, material memory, and circulation intersect. This work is called Silence, and it's an example of performance-based practice translated into a material form. She often uses natural resources found on the land in Timor-Leste, such as betel nut, natural dyes, red earth, ground rock powder. She uses them as art materials because they were scarce when she first returned in the early 2000s. Here, for example, she's using mosquito netting and fragments of traditional East Timorese ties, a local woven fabric sourced from community offcuts and cut into the shapes of lips. The work holds hidden narratives of strong resistance and painful remembrance of a collective trauma. In the next slide, we can see that this is another iteration of how it's hung in my collection, but also how it appeared during the exhibition that was held in the Sundaram Tagore Gallery early last year, January 2025. Incidentally, the curator of this show, which was called Silence and Disobedient Bodies, Reclaiming Her, was a good friend of mine called Loredana Pazzini, and who was based in Thailand, but works wherever she's asked to. It specifically talks about the period of occupation during the Civil War in Indonesia, when local women were rounded up in houses used for torture. They were forced to apply lipstick, kiss the walls, and to leave lip marks after suffering sexual violence. This work honors those women who suffered twice: the physical violence at the hands of the soldiers and the emotional trauma of suffering in silence and shame. Performance art is often excluded from markets and archives due to its ephemeral and time-based nature. Works like this that she prepared about the same performance that she gave in Venice allows her practice to circulate, to be preserved, and to enter institutional memory without losing its ethical core. I recently lent, I think then if we could have the next slide, yes. I recently lent this work to the Davis Museum at Wellesley College in Boston, where it continues its journey from lived history to artistic practice and into public and educational view. Silence is not only about what was endured, but it's about refusing erasure, ensuring women's histories are seen, held, and carried forward. The fact that Wellesley College is an all-women's college, together with the warm relationship I have with the curators as an alumna, felt like a safe space in which to entrust its journey. For those of you in the Boston area, these works will be there until this work will be there until the end of April. Next slide. So I will wind down the presentation by talking briefly about how I collect and the recently published book. It's really only with hindsight that I can join the dots of my learning and collecting journey. I recognize what Indonesian curator and contributor to the book Alia Swastika writes in her essay, Collecting as an Act of Feminist Care, that it goes way beyond a simple economic transaction. I try to collect with care and purpose and see myself as a custodian of the works, temporarily responsible for the conservation, visibility, and circulation of the collection. My focus is on amplifying, not defining artists' voices, particularly those that have been marginalized and overlooked. I prioritize meaning and impact, working to redistribute visibility and power through lending, research, and advocacy. Ultimately, my collection seeks to champion cultural memory and create space for dialogue, which I hope we'll have after this talk. These artists have nurtured and continue to nurture their own successful careers, and they are careers that sustain themselves. But as I have learned, there is always room for repetition, hence the book. The book, seen in the slide on the right, I'll just describe it because it contributes greatly to the understanding of the objectives. It has a soft cover that helps keep the weight down. No hardback cover here, and it differentiates itself from a coffee table book. It's more like a working manual. It was designed and printed in Singapore by the excellent design studio Swell and equally excellent Allegro printers. They were the ones that recommended overlaying the book with mull cloth, which is a kind of loose netting that's more commonly used for the bindings. And it also helps, it really visualizes the book's objective so well, which was to lift the veil of hidden stories from the region. It has a very short print run, only 500 copies, and is not for profit. It was a wonderfully collaborative effort. All the high resolution images in the book and that I have shared with you today were supplied by the artists and their representatives. The project management was handled by Audrey Yo and her entire team at Yo Workshop, who had originally encouraged me to publish it. It also has two essays written by the Filipino art historian Flodette May Datwin and Indonesian curator who I mentioned before, Alia Swastika. There are 35 artists in the book. I've only shown you 7, each giving their insights to the work featured. It was very important to me to hear their authentic voices, so there are selected texts in their own mother tongues. Not everyone chose to do that, but the ones that felt happier communicating in their mother tongue did. And there's a translation, of course. Each artist has 2 double-page spreads, and it is intended to be equally useful to new audiences to contemporary art and who want to dip their toes into Southeast Asian contemporary art in particular, and as a helpful resource to curators and academics in their research. This book is a further commitment to support the visibility of artists and their works. And in the next slide, the final slide, in conclusion, I hope we take from these examples that visibility that we've seen, that I discussed earlier, is rarely accidental. It is made, it is constructed. Visibility is created when artists organize themselves, when documentation is treated as essential rather than secondary, and when work circulates beyond the market, and when advocacy is sustained over time through repetition. Through my research, I learned that women don't mediate patriarchies in a single way. As I said, different contexts require different strategies. But what unites them is this recalibration of visibility, risk, and survival. They remind us that recognition doesn't always come from being chosen. If it often comes from building the conditions in which being seen becomes possible. So perhaps visibility begins not with permission, but with attention, given deliberately and sustained. Thank you for your attention and for listening, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you. Oh, I think there's one more slide. In case any of you would like to would like to explore further, here are some very useful resources. I'd like to highlight one in particular, which is the Art World Database online site for information pertaining to Southeast Asian contemporary art. They're really a very good starting point. They have comprehensive list of artist bios, calendar of events, organization information, a glossary of terms, as well as a wide selection of editorial content about artists in the region. The reason I know so much about it is it was created by two former MA students in the cohort before mine on the Goldsmith LaSalle program. And this is the last slide, which obviously shares the acknowledgements and influences from, Linda Nochlin with her landmark essay to Griselda Pollock asking us to rethink how history is written, Barbara Watson and I. Some of you will be familiar with these art historians and theorists. Yvonne Lowe, I wanted to include many from the region. Yvonne Lowe, who works out of Australia, Wulan Dirgantoro, Indonesian scholars and critics, like I've already mentioned, Professor Maida Tween, Elaine Legaspi Ramirez, Marianne Pastor-Roses. They all emphasize that feminist art practices in Asia emerge from local histories, cultural contexts, and lived experience, rather than simply adopting Western feminist frameworks. And I also greatly enjoyed that book. I keep telling you, it was very well written by the whole curatorial team and deepened my understanding of senior women artists in the region. And thanks, of course, to all of the artists whose work were featured here and who continue to inspire my collecting journey.
Thank you so much. Thank you for such a meaningful and wide-ranging presentation. And for everybody who might want to go into more detail about any of the references or acknowledgements to art historians that were mentioned, of course, as I mentioned before, this is recorded and will be shared with you, so you can always go back and look at the slides. Thank you so much, Krystina, for such a moving presentation as
You're
well.
welcome. I was very moved. I think it was really putting together this presentation reminded me about all, and I chose these particular artists to talk to this particular issue of visibility, and, recognizing their own difficult journeys. And it was conflating their journeys and who they were talking about. And it just all moved me very greatly.
Yeah, I think, going through kind of decades of Southeast Asian history, which has been incredibly traumatic, but also kind of coming out of it wanting to celebrate all the achievements and the agency and, how they have moved past, or maybe not past, but kind of absorb this processed it and been able to come out with, works of art that are so incredibly moving right now.
Mm.
So I would encourage anybody in the audience to please ask questions, ask Krystina questions about her collection, about Southeast Asian art. It would be wonderful to hear from you. And as we let you kind of marinate on any questions you might have, I think I have my own. So to start, in celebrating women, celebrating their artwork, how did you start collecting Southeast Asian women's art? Do you remember the first piece that you ever bought?
I do. It was the Octora piece. And
Okay.
that's why I include her in all the talks that I give. It's because it was the moment that I stopped, wandering around exhibitions, sort of wondering what I was looking at. Her work just stopped me in my tracks. And I realized something was going on that was, that there were many layers going, of interpretation. And
Mm.
I spoke to the gallerist. And if I'm right in thinking, Octora came to me from Gaja Gallery. And but when I first saw it, which was at one of the art fairs in Singapore in the very early days, the Southeast Asia focus, um, I wasn't collecting. I was still doing my studies. And when I saw that work, I decided to write about it in an essay. And then I decided to write about her as an artist in an essay. And then I remember saying to Gaja, listen, I'm so impressed by her work. Do you have any work by her? And this is where it came about. And I can say that's really just the first place that I decided to collect. Before that, there was another moment that I remember vividly when I was still a docent, and I volunteered to guide at an exhibition at the CCA that June Yap was curating, and it was a work that had come from the Guggenheim exhibition in New York, and it was brought to the region, and that was when I was in her briefing, and she was explaining about all these histories, the post the Cold War in particular,
Mm.
the history then. I really realized that despite having lived in Southeast Asia for such a long time, I knew very little about the difficult, traumatic parts. And when I went back to study, that's really what gave it the context to understand it. Yeah. So,
And from that very first piece, did you consciously from then on start collecting in the shape of the collection there is now? For example, I think, giving women visibility, highlighting certain strands
uh,
of
no,
no?
I had no clue what I was doing.
Okay.
It's that's why I say it was only in hindsight, because somehow that once that work was in our home, and then I started to, it was like a ripple effect. I started to see more works in the region. Um, when I was traveling, when I was on holiday, when I was going in the region, and I mean, it's a great thing to do is when you're on holiday, go to a local gallery and see what contemporary art is there. And
Mm.
I just kept being drawn back to women artists. And I don't know whether the seed was already set because I went to an all women's college in Boston, back in the 70s. Um, and maybe that sort of seed was planted then to be interested in women's education and issues that affect women. But it just hit home. I mean, I'm nearly 70, and it just hit home in the last 5 years. And all just came together, all the different
Mm.
strands of my life. And this collecting has just taken off from that.
It's a very inspiring collection, and I think there are people, and we have a question about the average gallery price for the seven artists combined, and which of these artists command the highest prices. I wonder if you can speak to the market for Southeast Asian art or Southeast Asian female artists.
Well, I'm glad somebody's asked about that because it's another way to sort of temper expectations about the budget that I have, which is not a lot. I know you're not really asking that personally, but I have been very, very um, able to create this collection because I enjoy looking at emerging artists. I then went on to, followed their careers, and then all of a sudden they became mid-career artists. And then for the very senior artists, and I shared established ones, Suzanne Victor and Imelda Caipe Andaya, for instance, Maria Madera, they're sort of the next level in terms of the price points, definitely, and in terms of their experience and longevity and work in the and recognition in the market. But I would say that I won't talk specifically about the works, but I will say that I I I have bought artworks in the hundreds of Singapore dollars or in pounds. Gosh, I don't know. I haven't lived here long enough to know the conversion yet.
It's about half.
Okay, so
Yeah.
like £100. I mean, this was 5 years ago, so I don't know how things are now, but I was spending hundreds of pounds, not thousands, in the early days. And it really is quite an education to ask the gallery owners to help you through. That's what they're there for, is to be able, you ask them questions about, you can even let them know your price point, um, but don't be intimidated by going into a gallery and asking these questions, because they're there to share information about their artists, and you'll be pleasantly surprised about the price of these works.
And I was thinking about you collecting kind of up and coming artists. Do you feel like you collecting their work has somehow shaped or contributed to the path that they've been able to take?
That
Um,
that they've been able to take. No, I don't think I have any influence on anybody's career. I mean, I love talking to them and
mm,
I love hanging out with them, and I will, try and support them as much as I can. But no, the people that really have what's the word? The best interests, obviously, they're commercial concerns, but the galleries, um, you know, help the career of these artists enormously. But also, what's very important is this institutions. And I love seeing that at some of the art fairs and at Art SG recently, that there are all these special funds that are given to, to institutions to collect a work from young artists or mid-career, and to follow them and input them into their national collections. I support that greatly.
mm. We have another question. So I think this pertains to perhaps the last two, so Suzanne, Victor, and Maria. Is there a pattern for some of these artists moving to Australia?
Well, I think Australia has a very good education system. I mean, I myself, oh, this is interesting. Thanks for that question, because although I was studying for my MA on the Goldsmiths program that was really in partnership with LaSalle in Singapore, one of the first symposiums that I attended was in Australia. It was in Sydney. And
Mm,
it was very influential in terms of my topic for women's art collectives. And I think that's where I met Professor Datween for the first time, Yvonne Lowe, my own professor, Dr. Claire Veal. They were
mm,
all very influential. But in terms of the artists going there, I think it's a combination of having this art education system, fine arts, as well as art history that supports it, as well as many institutions. So, yeah, I think it's a thriving market, and they feel welcomed there. I think it's also a halfway. It's a quicker journey to Australia than it is to London for education, and or the States, for instance.
yeah, I think Australia has quite a thriving academic scene of understanding Southeast Asian art, for example. I think that's why I understand that there are actually lots of
Yes.
people there
Yeah.
and generated from there. So perhaps that's why there's a lot of like
Yes. Yeah.
cross-cultural movement.
Yeah. They have a very good triennial.
Mm,
I can't remember where that is. Brisbane? I can't remember, but it's fabulous. And you'll be very pleased to see lots of Southeast Asian artists there. Um,
yeah.
yeah.
I think that is all the questions that we have so far, unless anybody has any more. But if you do and you can't really process it now, or you need some time to generate your question, please feel free to get in touch with us. Do keep a lookout for our next complimentary webinar on our Instagram at education.christies or on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Krystina, for this incredible presentation. It will be recorded and disseminated, so please look out for that as well. For more details on any of our courses or any of our webinars, please look out for us on Instagram, on LinkedIn, or find us at christies.com. Reach out to us at education@christies.com, and we would love to have you. Before I close, Krystina's book is actually available in Singapore, Manila, and New York. So if you're based in London and would like a copy, please reach out to us, education@christies.com again, to purchase a copy. And we'll help you make arrangements with Krystina, who has just moved from Singapore, as you might have heard previously. So she's still trying to arrange for a stockist here. But in the meantime, I'm very happy to mediate. Thank you so much for joining us for this Christie's Education webinar. Thank you once again, Krystina, for all your time and effort and passion for the subject and sharing it with the world. I'm very grateful. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks, Krystina.
Thank you very much. Thank you.